Okay, so again, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking specifically today at the introduction to the entire book. The introduction being Christianity and Other Religions, Problem and Promise. And we're going to be seeing how Knitter approaches the question of the theologies of religions and a little bit of history about the way that Christianity has dealt with other religions and evolved in terms of its understanding of them in the past. Okay. All right. The first section of the book has to do in the introduction with questions that increasingly need to be addressed. And one of the things that Knitter says is that these questions have always been relevant, but they become more relevant in our global society, more relevant, as we'll talk about a little bit later, in terms of the way things have moved in culture. The first of these is, why are there so many different religions? Shouldn't there be only one if the divine is only one? If God is one, should not there be only one religion? Another question that has been asked that needs to be addressed according to Knitter is, are all the religions valid in God's eyes? Are all of them equally effective in putting people in contact with the divine? And one way of thinking about this, as Knitter points out, is that the different religions can be thought of as differences in color or differences in facets. Are their differences more a matter of varied colors than of varied content? How should religions relate to each other? And perhaps a little bit more personally, how should my religion, whatever that may be, or lack thereof, relate to the others? Might I learn more from... What happened there? Might I learn more from them than what I have learned from my own tradition? Why do I belong to one religion rather than another? Okay, and we're moving on to the part of the book that talks about the many religions, a newly experienced reality. And one of the things that Knitter says in this part of the chapter is that he wants to avoid what he calls the pernicious dogma of relativism. And by that he means that attitude which says the differences between religions don't matter. The reason is because we don't have a concept of truth in our postmodern world. The debate, argument, and study and dialogue needed to gain truth is therefore moot. And a couple of things to talk about there. First of all, what is postmodernism? Now, many of you may have come across this concept in some of your other classes. And we're going to define it rather specifically in terms of religious studies. The idea is that history can be divided into a number of different eras. The first being the pre-modern era, the second being the modern era, and the era we are now in as the post-modern era. A short explanation, the pre-modern era and pre-modern civilization refers to those civilizations that are somewhat non-scientific, that have little to no technology, at least in the past, and societies in which religion was seen as the thing that could explain everything. So in other words, think back about the Middle Ages in Europe. Say there was a comet in the sky. Well, they could explain it as, oh, that is a reappearance of the star that led the wise men to Bethlehem, rather than thinking about the comet in different terms. Everything could be defined by, or rather explained by, religion. And also in the pre-modern religion, religion and government were very closely intertwined. And for the most part, most countries were considered a majority of one religion. If there were persons of another religion, they were in the minority. Oftentimes, they were ignored in terms of their culture. And the country was seen as triumphantly one religion. And again, think about Europe in the Middle Ages, when you had countries, at least in the early Middle Ages, all of them were, quote, Christian countries. And by Christian, they meant the Roman Catholic Church. That changes, of course, in the Reformation, but you still get countries that identify themselves according to their religion. You have Lutheran countries, Baptist countries, Catholic countries, and so on and so forth. So in the pre-modern era, religion was the one thing that held together everything, the one thing that explained everything, and the one thing that was intertwined with the government. Even today, as a matter of fact, the British monarchs are crowned not by the previous monarch, who in some cases is already dead. They are crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, a religious figure who institutes the rule of a particular monarch. Okay, so now that's pre-modern. The modern era begins with the increase in knowledge of science that begins with a movement called the European Enlightenment, which happens around the 17th and 18th centuries. The modern era sees religion not as the defining characteristic or the defining knowledge of a society, but sees science and observation and reason as the defining factor of the world. So in other words, in the modern period, you look up, you see a comet. Well, you explain it by talking about how comets revolve around the solar system and appear in the sky only at particular times and seasons. Science defines and explains everything. And along with this, there was a break, a fissure between religion and government, at least for the most part. In the United States, for example, which began in the 18th century, by the way, remember that, fully into the Enlightenment period, the United States instituted itself as a country where there was a clear separation between church and state. So in the modern world, religion no longer defines everything. Instead, you have science and reason. Religion becomes privatized. In other words, it is a matter between you and your understanding of the divine and maybe your fellow believers. But it was not part of government. And in the modern world, again, science and reason defines everything. Now, also in the modern era, there came to be a very clear idealization of science and technology. It began to be thought that eventually science and technology would bring about a perfect world. Bring about a perfect world. Now this specifically breaks down during the world wars of the 20th century, and specifically at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, you may remember from your history classes, we had the beginnings of the nuclear bomb. Bombs which could destroy an entire city. And that, along with the Cold War and the fear of nuclear annihilation, undercut the notion that science would bring about perfection. This wasn't part of my history, thank goodness I'm not that old, but it was part of the history of my parents, or it would have been if they had been children in the 40s and early 50s. There were nuclear bomb drills in schools. And what the nuclear bomb drill was that there would be an alarm, and the students were taught, if there is a nuclear bomb coming from Russia or whatever, what you do is you hide under your desk. And the slogan was, which was described in a catchy little ditty, was you duck and cover. Now, of course, ducking and covering would do nothing except put your skeleton in a rather interesting position when they found it years later. But again, the idea of science solving everything came to not fit. Now, in the postmodern world, remember, pre-modern world, religion explains everything. Modern world, science and reason explain everything. In the postmodern world, nothing explains everything. In other words, in a postmodern understanding, to some extent there has to be a combination or a blending of religious and spiritual experience and thought with scientific and reasonable experience and thought. And in some circles in the postmodern world, that becomes exaggerated to the point that you can't find anything that's true. And that's what Knitter is saying is a bad thing. He wants to say that there is truth that is discoverable and understandable through argument, study, dialogue, debate. Now, another thing about postmodern world where truth is contextual, truth is never absolute. Some of you may remember the phrase alternative facts. Well, that's a phrase that is very clearly part of what Knitter would call relativism. And again, he sees it as unhelpful and also harmful to human nature and to human life. So one of the things that he's going to say is that if we're going to talk about the connections between religions, what he believes needs to happen is that we have to, first of all, believe that there is something there that can be described as truth, and that we reach it not through saying, oh, differences don't matter, we're all happy. We reach it by strongly and deeply interacting with each other's thoughts, spiritual experiences, teachings, and so forth. He moves on in the chapter to talk about how in our postmodern world, in our contemporary world, the different religions are much more in contact with each other on an individual level. A quote from the book: "To have a friend, a colleague, a family member, or a spouse who has found meaning through a religious path that is starkly different from Christianity not only impresses, it disturbs. Such people are normal, happy human beings. They live lives of love, of service, and commitment." Okay, I do have a clip I want to show you, so I'm going to stop this share, and we're going to go to a new share. I'm going to pause the recording, as I mentioned, because Okay, so we've been talking about the interactions between individuals and how nowadays we can have people who are vastly committed to their own faiths marrying each other and thinking about how to raise their children. Another example of this, which was very interesting, was that I'm an Episcopalian, and one of the Episcopal parishes in this city had a particular priest, a woman priest, and she was married to a rabbi. So not only were they different religions, but they were ministers of different religions. Another thing the book mentions at this point is that nowadays the conversions between the world religions tend to balance each other out so that the numbers within those religions are to some extent similar as they were. Now, this of course changes with varying degrees. Islam and Hinduism, I believe, are two of the faiths that are gaining a good deal more converts than other traditions. I have to look that up to be sure, but that's what I seem to remember. Okay, in the next slide, he talks about the notion of plurality. And remember that this is the introduction. This is not anything to do with replacement theology. or the model replacement. So be very clear about that. No, let's go back. All right. Okay, so he quotes a theologian by the name of Edward Schillebeeckx, who lives from 1914 to 2009. And one of the things that he says is that the unshaken certainty that one continues to possess the truth oneself while others are totally mistaken isn't really a possibility anymore in this world. And that goes back to the previous slide where it talks about how people of different faiths, if you are of a particular faith and you are interacting with those of another faith, you eventually come to see that they are good people who live lives that are full, hopeful, and live lives oftentimes of very clear and constant devotion. And so that in and of itself shakes the notion that I can be totally right and you can be totally wrong. Also adding to the dilemma is the conviction of many that religion itself is bad. Religion itself leads to conflict, backwardness, superstition, and hatred. And some of this can, of course, be part and parcel of the mindset of certain atheists, while others are not quite as radical about that. Against this, Schillebeeckx does say, the multiplicity of religions is not an evil which needs to be removed, but rather a wealth which is to be welcomed and enjoyed by all. There is more religious truth in all religions together than in one particular religion. Now be very clear, this is not replacement theology. In fact, it's almost the opposite of it. But again, we're working with the introduction to the book rather than with the models that are to follow. Okay, are there any other questions at this point? Okay, another concept or another possibility the book talks about is seeing the different religions as a community of communities. It mentions a new philosophical perspective, which is born out of the scientific and anthropological writings of people like Darwin and Einstein. And Darwin, as we're going to see, is a huge enemy for at least one kind of thinking in Christianity. According to this philosophical perspective, everything is not a singular being, but a becoming through interrelationship. And how to contrast this? Okay. In your philosophy classes, you may have heard of René Descartes. And you may have heard the statement, I think, therefore I am. Okay, now what Descartes was doing was trying to give uncertainty its due and say, I am only going to embrace that which I cannot deny. He said, okay, I can think that everything around me is simply an illusion. I can think that nobody else exists except me. I can think that my emotions are simply hormones. The one thing I cannot deny is that I am thinking. And in order for thought to happen, there has to be a thinker. So if I think, I have to exist. But part of what that does also is that within the modern understanding, if you define being as thought, look at what you're leaving out. I think, therefore I am. That kind of definition of yourself is totally independent of everything and everyone else. And that is clearly not clearly not the total way of thinking about being. One of the questions that can be asked, if you walk up to someone and say, who are you? think about the answers they might give. They might say, I'm James Darwin, or I'm Jackie Priddlance. Okay, dig a little deeper. What does that name mean? Where did it come from? Well, my first name came from my great-grandfather on my mother's side. My last name comes from my father. Okay, right then and there, you're defining yourself in context with, and relationship with others. And you can think about that in terms of all the different aspects of your identity. I'm a college professor, but I can only be a college professor if a college exists. I can only be a college professor if students exist. So my being that is always in interrelationship with others. And a corollary of that, as the book mentions, is that each individual and each culture plays a role in the identity of the whole. Many become one precisely by remaining many and each making a distinct contribution to the others and thus to the whole. And this goes back to something that was being said in the other book, where what we want to see in terms of pluralism, or at least in terms of that author, is not the old-fashioned notion of the United States as a melting pot, because that flattens out all the differences between cultures and all their intensity and their goodness. Instead of a melting pot, let's think about the United States as a stew, where each ingredient retains its own taste and its own texture, but contributes to the identity of the whole. Okay, any questions, any other questions at this point? And again, we're recording, so please put them in chat. You can speak them out loud if you want to, but the chat is available for those who want to remain anonymous. Okay, hearing none, we'll move on. Another corollary of this mode of thinking is that knowledge itself is not relative, but knowledge itself is contextual. In other words, everything I know through the filter and through the coloring of my own culture and my own personal perspective. One way of thinking about that, you may have heard the old notion that the Eskimo language has like 40 different words for snow. And English has snow, sleet, and that's about it. Part of what's going on, according to that, is that since the Eskimo culture is so intimately intertwined with the experience of snow, their knowledge of it is much more differentiated than the knowledge of those who speak only English. So we know things through our cultural and personal perspectives. And Knitter talks about this as seen through our own telescopes. He also, however, wants to say that part of what's going on in this book is the attempt to, or at least the consideration of, borrowing someone else's telescope, and so broadening your knowledge of truth. Okay, any questions at this point? Okay, we'll move a little bit further. Okay, the next section of the book, or rather continuing with the community of communities. Not only is this more prevalent nowadays of looking and experiencing and at least being somewhat familiar with other cultural perspectives, is the notion that Knitter wants to talk about that's having only one cultural perspective is, quote, dangerous, unquote. And here's where he talks about the notion of ideology. Truth becomes ideology, according to Knitter, when a group or society or religion pursues, affirms, and proclaims something as true, not only because they believe it really is so, but because whether they realize it or not, it maintains their power over others. Okay, so this in some ways goes back to the notion we were talking about before about a majority religion squashing a minority religion, about a particular society conquering another country, and so forth. A couple of examples of what might be called ideology. I wonder if many of you, probably in your history courses, have heard about the concept of manifest destiny. And that was the concept that was prevalent in the years of the United States moving westward. And the notion was that our manifest destiny, we are meant to conquer and colonize from one ocean all the way to the other ocean, the Pacific. And part of what's going on here again is, of course, that belief gives the European colonists power over the Native Americans. And another one that you perhaps might not have heard is what is called the doctrine of discovery. And that doctrine came into being around the time that this hemisphere was, quote, discovered by the Europeans. The doctrine of discovery mentioned that whoever, quote, discovers a particular area of land is then the owner of that particular area of land. And part of this had to do with the competition between Spanish colonists and French colonists and British colonists. But what it becomes again is this power over those who are already here, power over the Native Americans. And the book says that ideology is in some ways very easy to come by and very easy to fool yourself into believing. It makes the comparison that ideology is like bad breath. You can't detect it yourself. Other people are the only ones who can tell you, you need a mint. So part again of what is going on is that we approach the world through our own cultural perspective. And it's very easy to attribute that cultural perspective to be the one and only truth. There was a philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault. And one of the things that he said is that truth claims easily become power claims. So what you believe is truth very often leads to a particular power. Another example. There is some truth in talking about the difference between female and male. There is some truth in the discussion of DNA in terms of female DNA, male DNA, and there is some truth in terms of the various reproductive functions between male and female. But embracing that truth can very easily and very often has become, okay, a woman is softer and less physically bulky than a man, therefore men are stronger. And since men are stronger, men are the ones who should defend the home. Men are the ones who should go out and hunt because they've got bigger bodies and bigger muscles. And men, therefore, should have power over the women. So a truth claim becomes a power claim. Okay. The book goes on to talk about the idea of being a citizen of the world. And this idea for Knitter is the notion that each person still has their own native culture. My culture, because of where and how I was born, is second generation Italian American. So I have my own culture and my own, quote, mother tongue, but it is also good and possible for me to learn and understand and converse in other cultural or religious languages. So just going back to that silly example, by birth I'm an Italian American, but even though I love pasta, I can learn to appreciate gefilte fish, which is traditionally a Jewish food. So this notion of being a world citizen is still having your own particular identity, but being able to appreciate and to some extent converse in others. And that holds true on a broader scale for cultural and religious differences. Okay, I thought I heard somebody. Let's see if there's a question in chat. Oh, come on. No, I don't see anything. Okay. All right. The book goes on then to, now remember again, this is the introduction. It has nothing to do with replacement theology. The book goes on to talk about the prevalence and the persistence and the vitality of different religions causes to some extent a theological problem, certainly for Christianity, and to some extent for other religions as well. Certainly Islam, to some extent Judaism, a little bit less so for Hinduism and Buddhism. But the fact that these different religions not only have survived, but in some cases have thrived, and in many cases have provided to their adherents a very clear and a very meaningful notion of the divine and of spiritual reality. The book, this particular chapter towards the end of it, asks this. We can explain the fact that the Milky Way is there, we as Christians, by talking about the doctrine that God created the world and the cosmos. But how do we explain the fact that the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the most holy scriptures of Hinduism, how do we explain the fact that that still exists? So how do Christians, or in what ways do Christians explain the existence of other religions and the existence of faithful and good people within those other religious traditions who find their religions very meaningful and very helpful and they are very committed to them? Okay, let's see, are there any other questions at this point? Okay, I'm going to stop the share since that, or rather stop the recording, since that is about the end of where I want to get with this